Good morning, Professor Spooner. How are you today?
Good morning, Frank. I'm fine, thanks, and I hope you are too.
Good, thank you.
The news now is all about this new coronavirus, and it's interesting that it started in the same part of the world as the SARS virus, which was how many years ago? Was it 2003?
I think it was about 2003 or four. Yeah, yeah.
Um, and it seems as though, like several other health problems that we've dealt with, or we haven't dealt with, but have been dealt with in the recent past, it comes from it's an infection from animals to humans, and the one thing that our ability to reorganize is not so advanced in I mean, we seem to manage to reorganize politically and economically reasonably well, but health is very difficult. And it's interesting that the Chinese have responded very quickly and relatively efficiently. They informed the World Health Organization. The World Health Organization decided that it was not an international emergency so far. However, a number of people have died from it already in China, and it has spread to, I think I read somewhere, 11 other countries.
Oh, I think at least by now the United States reported its third case this morning.
And I think 2 cases in the US so far?
I believe 3.
3?
Yeah, as of this morning.
And in every other part of the world, Australia at one end, and the Southeast Asia, and Europe, as well as America. So I would have thought that was enough to make it an international emergency. And the big question is, what can be done, and who can do it in order to stop the spread of infections like this, to prevent it from becoming an international epidemic.
Right.
The WHO is obviously the only international organization with a mandate to do that sort of thing, but it has relatively little power. And this is the big problem with the United Nations. Anything that has to do with the United Nations, it has representation, but no authority.
Right. Can I just make 2 observations, if I may?
Yes, please.
All right. There was an article in the New York Times this morning which talked about how, but for the way the Chinese political system is organized, there was a feeling that authorities could have had a jump on this virus much sooner. And the article went on to explain that there's a silo kind of reporting system in China, from the smallest village or province all the way directly up to Beijing. And nobody is particularly interested in rocking the boat, so they try to handle things on a local level where perhaps in an adjoining city the same issue is occurring and they're not aware of it. And it's not until the information is sufficiently disastrous that somebody in Beijing is reading it and saying, my goodness, this is happening in 3 towns that are next to each other. This is actually a big problem. And I think we see that Xi Jinping has really jumped in and assumed personal control / responsibility for this with his actions of yesterday. And the other thing that always amazes me is this virus, like the SARS virus, apparently also stemmed from human contact with animals. And I keep remembering, maybe it's because I have pets myself, but I keep remembering that it wasn't that long ago, chronologically speaking, maybe 150 years ago, that most of humanity had very close contact with animals all of the time. I mean, you hear stories from elderly people about how maybe when they were growing up in the farm on very cold nights, they would take the cows into their home because it was 50 degrees below zero or something. And so, I mean, I don't know what that means. Does it mean that the melange of different animals together is combining some sort of different biological soup? Or is it that
Well,
our immune systems
it,
have become so different, if not weakened? I don't know.
it it's not only some time ago. When I was doing ethnographic research in Iran and Afghanistan, I spent some time living with uh, um, pastoral nomads, and they were living with the animals.
Of
The
course.
animals were in their tents,
Hmm.
and they're still doing that.
Hmm.
So even though we aren't doing it, other people are,
Hmm.
and they're not catching diseases.
Well, that probably then would, and I'm not a biologist, but that it would seem to me then that might indicate that the further distant we become time-wise and distance-wise from
We
it.
lose the immunity.
Exactly.
Uh, the That's an interesting idea, uh, but of course we have. I don't know whether the animals we keep in our homes are also separate, completely separate from other animals, and therefore, uh,
This is
um,
true. This is a good point. That's a good point. Yeah.
uh, anyway, health seems to be one of the things I think we've mentioned before is nutrition,
Mm.
health and nutrition. That is everything that connects what we are biologically with what we are politically, economically, and socially, is um, scientifically much less advanced than the science that we focus on.
Let me ask you from a globalization and organizational perspective. Um, I have always hoped that somewhere beyond all the noise and bluster of politicians coming from Washington, Moscow, Brexit, and China and elsewhere, that there exists some sort of functioning, working biological response, global response unit in the event of a worldwide pandemic outbreak. Um, I mean, maybe it's because I've seen too many science fiction movies that I think that the existing process would be usurped by wiser minds and people in white suits and making sure that the contagion doesn't spread. But I, you mentioned the WHO, of course, being akin to the UN, relatively toothless as far as authority goes. But I mean, we've talked also before about how the CDC in the United States maintains links with its brethren entities around the world. And I'm wondering, how deeply in place do you think a international response mechanism is if this coronavirus really turns very deadly and begins to spread?
Uh, I think we have absolutely no organization to manage it.
Hmm.
And the sort of things that the Chinese are doing within China, I think most countries would have a great deal of difficulty doing. Um, I mean, it's interesting that this is this starts in a place, a city called Wuhan, which is not very far east of west of Shanghai, in central China, and it's at the most important festival of the year when everybody visits everybody else. And they've been able to impose a complete moratorium on
Yep.
all travel.
Yep. Yeah, it would
Uh,
be like shutting down the air traffic control system and the road system into the northeastern part of the United States over the Christmas holidays. Think
yeah.
of that. Think of that.
Um, who has the authority to do that? So um, uh, I think that in fact we need some that is, I suppose that the WHO is the body that has to do it. But if you think historically now, from the flu epidemic 100 years, almost exactly 100 years ago now,
Hmm.
which, as far as I can remember, is the first relatively international epidemic that we'd had. And that was at a certain early stage of globalization. And then we've had several things since then, including more recently things like Ebola, the measles.
Right, right.
Apart from SARS, we remember SARS because it was Chinese, but we don't think of the ones that actually started in the Western world. But there have been quite. I was thinking actually earlier on this morning that it's probably an increasing incidence of this sort of thing, and so the outlook for the future is something that that really needs to be taken care of.
Well,
Um,
I suppose in the constitutional democracies or the Western democracies, obviously there are provisions for national security emergencies. I mean, I know this government has that. So I would assume that in the event of some similar outbreak here, the president with the gang of eight, if you will, the top congressional leaders would have to be able to make some very quick decisions, and I'm sure the British system is the same way. But again, it goes back to just a larger circumference silo as compared to what we were talking about in China. All right. I mean, how is the government of the United States going to talk to the government of Canada and the government of the United Kingdom, et cetera, to make sure that there's cooperation? And that's what I guess you fall back to the WHO. And I just hope that there have been preparations made, games schemed out, played out, and planned to deal with something like this. And I hope that people have paid enough attention to them from a individualistic, nationalistic perspective. I don't know. I don't know.
I think authority would be a big problem. And to some extent, of course, it's relatively easy for the Chinese to isolate themselves, and for England or the United Kingdom to isolate itself, and for North America to isolate itself because it's got just two borders,
Right.
or the United States got two borders. But Europe, almost impossible.
Mm-hmm.
All the way from um, France to
Sure.
the far east of Russia.
The same with Asia.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
Um,
it. Let me just ask one final question. Back during the bubonic plague era, um, was there any governmental awareness or response or recognition that perhaps some sort of measures could be taken to quarantine or to eradicate the disease? I mean, was there a governmental response, or did people just think it was the vengeance of God that was causing it?
I'm glad you brought up the bubonic plague because I had not thought of that, and that obviously was probably um, not only the earliest of this type of problem, but it it started long before the time that we generally think of it.
Mm-hmm.
That is, there was an outbreak of plague in the 6th century CE
Oh, really?
in Egypt, which spread into the Persian Empire and the Roman Empire, and had something to do with the spread of Islam.
Really?
That is, this I've never seen anybody write it up anywhere, but it seems to me something that needs some research, because it's very difficult to explain how Islam spread so fast, and the Persian Empire came to an end so easily at the same time that the plague spread. And then, of course, we know that the plague originally came from China again. And there have been other outbreaks of plague. I don't remember of that plague, and I don't remember when others were at the moment. But the bubonic plague, as we call it in the what is it, the 14th century?
Yes, 1300s. Yeah.
As far as I know, nothing was done.
Yeah, I don't think so either. Yeah, I think there was a lot of praying. Probably that was the extent of it. So, well, what do you think will happen between now and the next time we talk, if I can ask?
I think we should stay indoors.
And away from animals. So, all right, that's a good point to end it on. All right, Professor Spooner, thank you very much. We'll look forward to our next conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
I I didn't know about that other